You're tuned in to RX Radio.
How many people you think get into fitness and their goal is to have a six-pack?
Less now than I think used to be the case.
Okay.
Right? Like, I think,
why do you think it's less now?
Right. Well, dude, six-pack shortcuts. That was early days. That's like if you were to make a YouTube fitness museum. What was his name? Mike Chang? Remember that fucker?
No. Who the fuck's
No,
that?
dude, Mike Chang, six-pack shortcuts. Let me see. Dude, he's like...
Oh, that was his thing.
That was his thing. What happened to six-pack shortcuts? A sad story of Mike Chang and six-pack shortcuts. Like, Mike, that's the fact that this...
Right now, like, what's the sad story?
I have no idea how this guy turned into a much more music special. Like, what the fuck? Yeah, Mike Chang's six-pack shortcuts was like... he looks old. Well, I guess he's old. It started fucking 20 years ago. Man, didn't you know he found himself and has a ponytail? Can people not do that? Like, can you evolve as a human without just wearing Henleys all the time as shirts? Like, do you have to have 3 buttons on a long sleeve every time you find spirituality? Like, fuck. Anyways, so I think less because of that. I honestly think maybe less per concentration, like a relative percentage of people who come in. And I will offer another piece of evidence into the proceedings. The dad bod came in, right? Like, you couldn't have sold that bullshit fucking 20 years ago. Let me tell you that for free.
Yeah, I guess that's true. I feel like fitness aesthetics for the general population have shifted more towards like athletic aesthetics than like just being skinny or just having a six-pack. So I think I can agree to that. Like the fitness culture on the whole has shifted. It used to be very like eating disorder-esque. Like fitness was an eating disorder like 20 years ago. And now it's like there's a little bit more of an air to health to it.
Well, you know what it is.
You don't agree.
I'm gonna do a recall back to one of your points about our pre-workout nutrition from a couple. I think it was last week's episode or Monday's episode. Sorry. No. But I think you're saying the same thing, just with different verbiage. Like, I think what's happened is you can sell the six-pack shortcut, and if people adhered to the protocols and the diet, like, I'm sure this Mike Chang guy is like probably not as full of shit as we may think. I haven't gone into his stuff, but like most people, especially back then, I found were relatively measured, right? Like, there was a guy going in on oxygen the other day, talking about oxidate, right? Like, what? This is where we're at. Like,
what do you even go in on?
Right. There's just like oxidative stress, and anyways, it's just like the bar for sensationalism back then was very low, so it didn't take a lot of these crazy claims. So as I think 2 things have happened, like as the shift, quite literally, of the Mike Chang's himself has shifted from six-pack shortcuts to be 1% better every day. That's his thumbnail. I think 2 things has happened. Guys, girls, people who are in the forefront of selling in the fitness industry, they themselves have, evolved or changed, or their interests have changed. But alongside of that, their market, both the market and the demographic that they appeal to, has grown up and likely changed along with them. But what has replaced that market is not the same. The demographic of like 20, or maybe even let's drop it back to like 18 to 25. That market is not the same as it was when we were 18 to 25. So I think the push for health is 2 parts. It's the fact that the bulk of the spend, like the audience, the market that spends money in fitness, is now just getting older. And underneath that pyramid, the 18 to 25 crowd is not spending the way that the previous 18 to 25 used to spend. So part of it is the influencer, air quote influencer, is evolving their content around their life and their evolution. And I think because there's no point in recapitulating your content to the interests of the younger generation, because it's just not the same market. And the second thing, I think, for those who are pushing health and being a little bit more fluffy around the edges is the entire market at whole doesn't want to work. People don't want to work to get in shape, and because fitness used to be more fringe, right? Like the hooded bodybuilder in the corner that, you know, was wearing like an unbranded hoodie that was like ripped up, or it was some like football team who followed with the Belichick sleeve cut. Like the guy genuinely didn't want anyone to see him work out. He genuinely did not want to have his picture taken. I remember being around those guys when like camera phones started to be a thing. But those guys would fucking work. And like, you know, they would go out and spend what money they had left from the fucking paychecks of working on an assembly line. And they would buy the protein powder and they would buy the pre-workout and they would kind of live their happy life. There's not now the accessibility of fitness from a market standpoint and like the cult of personalities that's come with that. It's like even the hardcore fitness now is like, you know, the fucking whatever I don't want to speak poorly on a brand, but like the lone wolf fucking dark sport type. Right. It's like, it's ridiculous. But it's ridiculous relative to what it's trying to represent and what that demographic was. So I think the push to health is a push to broad appeal. It's a push to, you know, I heard the term the other day, I haven't heard in a while, like the body positivity movement, I think has left some sort of remnants on this. And I think there's been a real misunderstanding, like, because it is easy and we know what eating disorders are, right? Like we know firsthand, like I could write a book on binge eating disorders, a how to, like this would literally be like binging for dummies. Like this is how it's done, folks. Sit down and take notes. But it's, you know, like I think that as the fitness attempts to reach more of the general market, it has to soften its messaging. And I think in the byproduct of that, it's taken people who are on the fence of being a little bit more, dare I say, dedicated. And it's pushed them into the side of, well, I should probably be like conscious of my health. It's like maybe being hardcore is conscious of your health.
Yeah. I think it's not the easy thing to do. It's very easy to buy a sweatshirt with a bunch of wolves on it. But I think you make a really good point around like the market and where people are spending money relative to fitness. Because even if I think back to like when I was, like probably 12 years old, like the market of fitness was selling home fitness equipment. It wasn't like Instagram sponsored ads for protein powder or like and it was like targeted towards like my parents, not me. It's like on TV, it's in magazines, like you ordered this equipment. And two pieces of equipment that I remember having at home my entire childhood was like that. It was like this cage that had like a pillow for your head and rockers on the bottom, and these pads you put your arms on to.
I don't know what the fuck your dad told you that was, dog, but that does not sound like a workout equipment. Yeah, I'm gonna phone your dad in right now. I got his number. I'm gonna call him right quick. You're like, yo, the jig is up, dog. He thinks that was exercise equipment.
For sure.
What the fuck did you just say?
All right. Cage was a little much, but it's like this metal like thing. It's basically a thing to do sit-ups from. Like, no idea
okay.
It's like a metal aluminum piping that's got a pillow on it and the bottom's curved, so you just basically do sit-ups. You never seen that fucking thing? Right,
okay, I think there might be one. If it's what I think it is, there might be one in the upstairs of Gold's Venice. Is that what you're talking about? If you go upstairs in Gold's Venice, no, you don't got a working memory of that? Okay, that's my bad. All right. Okay, let's pretend like you're not talking about a sex swing real quick.
Let's pretend that didn't happen. We'll talk about the second piece of equipment.
Okay, great. All right, bench press or whatever. Go.
An ab roller. Like those are the two pieces of equipment that I remember just always having, like from a young age, and like maybe a few other things, like some handles to do push-ups on, like a door pull-up bar. But like the marketing effort on things like that was towards the people who are going to buy them. It was like towards my parents, probably people in their, I don't know, late 30s, early 40s at that point. Okay, like fast forward to today. Now, what are marketing efforts based on for people in that demographic, in that demographic that want to lose weight? It's things like fucking Ozempic and like drugs and like other things that are, you know, there's a little bit different kind of take on where people are going in this industry. And I think part of that is like, okay, people want the easy fix, but also I think the other part that not the Ozempic crowd, but like the way things are going in terms of like people focusing on health and that being, like you said, the hard thing to do, is that I think that education plays a really big role in that. Like there's a lot more information now on like people are understanding. Like there's the cutting edge information that's impactful and it means something. And it kind of gets distilled down to application over time. And then it takes time for that application to kind of creep its way into the mainstream to be the widely accepted point of view, or like this is how you go about things. And I think maybe like saying that fitness was like an eating disorder 20 years ago, that's kind of what I'm saying in a more sarcastic way, is that like there was a small crowd of people that like understood that if I wanted to get stronger and leaner and health, then I had to be healthier to be able to do that. Like health was kind of the foundation of that. And now I think there's more evidence coming out. It's more widely accepted that like, look, health is the first thing, and then you get these other things. Like even like the push, like one of our sponsors for the podcast, Marek, like getting blood work done in like the free market as like just a thing that people do to check on their health. Like that was something like people might do once they were sick like 20 years ago, and just have like their GP look at the labs and be like, oh yeah, your cholesterol's high, here's some drugs for that. But now it's people that are looking at that in a more proactive sense, and they're like, all right, like these are the health markers that are like deviating from optimal or deviating from what would be ideal. Let's take care of those. And there's a little bit more of a pointed focus on some of these more health focused variables. And I think that's been the major shift over that period of time. And the internet has only accelerated that. So it's accelerated that, which has made like the market much more broad. So there is like the Ozempic crowd. There's the crowd that like, honestly, that we sell to, the education crowd, like the trainers, the people that want to learn more so that they can train better. There's, you know, the people that just want to consume the popular content from, you know, I don't know who fitness influencers are now, but like fitness influencers that, like you mentioned, you were at that gym was it Houston, the Alpha Elite gym?
Oh yeah. Shout out to Davey Swole.
Right, Davey Swole. There's that group that's like kind of making fitness cooler from a younger age, and then with that, it's like, all right, you like this thing, and it may be this like dopamine rush, like they want to look good on social media, whatever it is, but like to do that, you still have to understand how to do that. And I think that's the process that people are becoming more competent in, is understanding how to actually get in shape. And I think that's been the difference that I've seen.
Interesting. Yeah. I think you touched on something with the motives, right? Like, because you can, I'm trying not to take a pessimistic slant, but I think social media.
That's okay.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay, good. I just think social media has introduced. Think of it this way: like, what is the smallest town near where you grew up? Like the smallest, like has like fucking 40 people or whatever.
Yeah, it's where my dad lives right now, Shikshinny, Pennsylvania.
That's hilarious. That sounds so made the fuck up. Okay, how many people other than your dad live there?
It's easy to say if you have less teeth. I think that's why they
That's good. I like that. Okay, so how many people roughly live there?
Yo, there's probably like, I'll Google it after I say this while you talk, but like,
okay,
it's got to be in the hundreds.
Okay, so like, let's think of a town like that, and let's postulate for this that they have a school. Like there's a school that
as of 2022, 629 people.
That's fucking hilarious. Your dad would live there. So when let's say that there's a school there, that school might service, you know, kindergarten to grade 12, right?
Right.
That's I grew up in towns where that was a thing, where the school was just, and you know, there's a lunchroom in that's pretty fragmented because you have a 16-year-old with a fucking 5-year-old, right? But it's just kind of like, whatever, it's this communal thing. That was fitness, you know, 20 years ago. Like when fitness YouTube started out and there was the Mike Changs of the world, and we were, you know, you were seeing the percolation of really what the model was when you were watching Mike Chang YouTube stuff. You know, the 6-pack shortcuts is, where did they learn that? They learned it from late night TV. Did you have a friend? So my friend Shane Butnary, his father's was and is, shout out fucking Bob Butnary, legend, who's in very good shape. And he bought a Bowflex. Did you have any friends with a Bowflex?
Oh yeah, fuck yeah.
Yo, that was nuts, dog. That was such like a rich friend flex situation. But I remember Buttonary had a Bowflex. And how did he buy it? Because his dad's up all hours of the night, fucking crawling the
Yep.
walls, watching late night infomercials, right? So he's got the fucking Sham Wow and the Bowflex, and he's just buying shit off of TV. When we consider what has like how did early days fitness evolve from a marketing perspective, they evolved from what was working at the time, like what grandfathered that in was the late night infomercial. So I look at like the total addressable market in fitness, like the lunchroom at a schoolhouse in Chick-shinny, Pennsylvania. And there's maybe a kid who's thinking about being gothic, but he's sitting by himself anyways, and there's no table of goths. And there's like a kid who's like kind of athletic, and there's like a kid who's kind of smart, but they all kind of just commingle, and no one really deviates away because there's like this collective smorgasbord identity, and there's really not enough people to fully represent an idea or a clique or a group, right? But then, how big was the high school you went to?
I graduated with I think 160 in my
Okay,
class.
that's like pretty small by America standards.
Yeah.
Like, say you go to one of these fucking mega church high schools in East Texas or some shit like that, and there's 7,000 people in a graduating class or something ridiculous. You're going to start to see the single thought of like, Marilyn Manson in one kid's head in a lunchroom in Chick-shinny schoolhouse is actually fucking 17 people with eyeliner on sitting at a table, right?
Right.
So, the highs are high, the lows are low, right? Like you talked about the availability of information being drastically different. That's true. But I think like there's a hierarchy there, like an education or a knowledge hierarchy there that exists. But there's also like I'm remiss to use the word depth, but for the sake of being consistent with the other dimension, maybe there's a width. There's a width to the types of conduits into what we will call the fitness industry, right? Like I remember being in the Arnold Classic powerlifting meet in Melbourne, Australia. I think my first year there. So I would have been like 2016, 2017. And I remember it was great. It was really well done. The warm up room was this big sort of caged off area. The platform was great. There was probably 7,000 people watching the meet live, which is like pretty crazy for powerlifting. Like, holy fuck.
Yeah, that's nuts.
But I remember being in the warm up room, and like the next exhibit over in the convention center in Melbourne was kids doing Rubik's cubes. And I'm like, how did we get here? They're like, it's kind of it's expanded to involve a lot of the quote unquote, like the fringes. And I think the umbrella term of health is what allowed that expansion to occur, right? Because health is sort of, I'll use the word holistic sparingly. But it allows these things that couldn't otherwise be categorized to now have like a click at the lunchroom table, right? So, I think it's easy for us, and oftentimes we look at the industry on a scale of, time with, as we've been in it for about 20 years, but we also look at a scale from quality of information, because that's what we've been focusing on for 20 years is how do we learn more to impart and get better results and all that. But like, there's so many other dimensions of change in the fitness industry that like you're walking into this collective lunchroom and you're like, holy fuck, I don't even know what these things are. Right. Like, I don't know, a table full of like, I don't know what's like this kid. I saw someone explain it to me. I live in a weird neighborhood, and there is these like kids who were not Asian, but they were dressed like Asian people, and they're like, I mean, I know the way I look and how bad that sounds. Like, but I was like, what is
You
it's
can't say that anymore.
right, grandpa. No, it was like a style of like for
Okay.
fuck's sakes.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They look
No,
like
I
anime
don't.
characters.
I'm just
I
saying, okay, so
know. Okay, shut up. Okay, shut
Okay,
up.
yeah.
Shut up. Shut up.
I don't
No,
want to know.
they look like they dress like they're anime characters in real life.
Yeah,
That
that's
when
weird.
I was a kid in the equivalent schoolhouse, there wasn't that as an embodied person.
Right.
Right? There was
Yeah.
like a kid who liked Pokemon, not 14 kids that dress like cartoon characters. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? This is technically called in evolutionary biology, I think it's called meme theory. I didn't want to say meme theory because I think everyone's brain goes to like pictures and words on the internet. But I think the technical term by Richard Dawkins is this idea of meme theory, that something as we expand in population, something that might be an idea in your head or a fleeting thought or like a certain proclivity or affinity for a behavior or a way of approaching the world at a big enough scale, there's one person who embodies that wholeheartedly as an individual. And at a big enough scale, there's a group of them, right? So that's where I think the fitness industry is at. And I think it's just a matter of like, it's a dimension problem. Like when we're looking at things, they're so multidimensional. Like, part of what we're talking about with the 6-pack fitness being like, how big of a catalyst is it? It's like, well, I think the initial catalyst started from intersecting dimensions of what was maybe in vogue in the time, like what were the beauty standards? Like, Lizzo was not on the cover back then, right? Like
No.
Lizzo was on the cover of Weight Watchers. She wasn't on the cover of fucking Vogue magazine, right? Like
Right.
those were different times.
Yeah.
If you looked at Hollywood actors back in the 90s, they were still proper jacked, right? Not
Yeah.
like they were in the 80s, but like late 90s into the 2000s, that's when you started to see the shift to like the skinny front man. But up until that point in movie history, if you had a front man, like he had to be pretty jacked, right? So there's an intersection of societal standards. There's an intersection of what has come initially before. So I think what we saw with the 6-pack and why I think in higher concentrations we saw it was because the intersecting dimensions of that time and space was really just like what we were selling was a byproduct of that. And I think today still what we see selling is just the byproduct of the intersections of a bunch of different environmental influences. And I just think at the time the most prolific environmental influences that wielded power over the addressable market was that sort of like 6-pack. The standards of body composition were different, especially for men back then. The type of sales mediums that we were moving from, late night TV, like Bowflex, into Mike Chang era. But now what makes it more difficult is, you're going through this fucking high school thing and you're like, what? You're like you with the Japanese people who aren't Japanese that look Japanese. You're like, I don't even know what these things are. Like, I don't even know, like, what is this group? Wasn't a group when I was a kid, right? So I think that's a little bit of what we're seeing. So to your original question, I think that the simplicity around the 6-pack promise made it more viable of a sell because of all of those reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's very true as you speak on it. And the line that I draw in my head is back, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s, like media was media. Media was like television, it was print. It was very curated by a very few, like a very small number of people, and it was very very monopolized, right? And now media is social media, right? Media is that lunchroom with 1,000 kids in it, and there's 13 kids dressing in a way that you described that just reminds me of any coffee shop in San Francisco, but but people are able to congregate in these ways on social media because now the lunchroom is, I don't know how many people are on Facebook, like probably 7 billion people or something like that, something along the line. I don't fucking know. Like it's got to be in the bills. Like 5 billion, you think?
There's
Anyways,
8 billion people in the world.
okay. All right. Well, I'll give it a solid 3 then. I'm gonna say 3.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Across Meta's platforms of WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook, I think that's an
It
insane amount of people.
Yeah, if there's a niche of type of human, they exist on the internet, and that's
Sure.
terrifying. But aside from that, like it's people are able to find their niche a lot easier and kind of express that and dig deeper into it, as opposed to it just being an idea in their head. And I think I don't know how training has evolved as like a parallel to that. I don't know if I have a readily available parallel in my head, but I know that my perception on training has changed over that course of time, because a lot of it was influenced by like mainly print media. Like you would see like you see fucking Arnold Schwarzenegger and you see like some of the OG bodybuilders, and that was like, I think bodybuilding is where like fitness culture kind of emerged from, because like strength sports were very very niche. Like even I'd say early 2000s, like early 2010s, I think is when they start to become a little bit more emergent, a little bit more popularized. But I think back then it was like you look at bodybuilders and that's what you think of as like as fitness, as health. And it might be a little bit different today. I think the term fitness has been watered down to maybe more of what it is, a more like obtainable, reachable thing that's not this, very niche, very like end of spectrum outlier thing. It's like, no, fitness is like kind of just a person that like is pretty healthy and they eat reasonably well and they live for a long time, versus like being super jacked and like doing whatever the fuck Arnold Schwarzenegger was doing back in the day. So I think that's like the perception has changed from it being this very like outlier unattainable thing to this very, mainstream obtainable thing. And I think around that, like my perception of training, because like core training for a six pack is different than I think of core training as it to be today. Like core training to me is like that's it's kind of the crux of training. Like physical health is, if you don't understand how to use your core and how that applies and the implications upstream, downstream to that, then you're not really going to be very successful in your training career. And even to echo outside of that, if we're really talking health and we're talking like applicable fitness to day-to-day life, like if you don't really understand how to use your core, you're just that much more susceptible to injury in day-to-day life. Like you're probably not very strong, which I don't know the studies on this, but like there's a lot of correlations to muscle mass and mortality, right? Higher muscle mass, less mortality. Like just being active and having greater bone density, greater muscle mass, those are things that are generally going to help you to be more healthy in terms of like health markers, in terms of like things we talked about on a couple previous podcasts, like insulin sensitivity, like blood pressure, cholesterol, things like that. Just having greater muscle mass is going to help you regulate better biologically, versus like resist the elements of your environment. So I think core training back then, yeah, maybe it was to get a six pack and to look a specific way, and that hasn't gone away. But I think in my mind, I have a greater understanding of the implications on day to day life of core training, and that's like I work with a lot of injured people. You and I, we work with a lot of athletes. I work with a lot of strength specific athletes. Like core training is still kind of the crux of training to me. And if I get someone that's brand new to training, maybe they're injured and they want to rehab, or maybe it's someone that's brand new to training and I'm their conduit into training, I'm always going to start with core training. And I'm going to start with it in a way that allows them to learn and understand how to use their core in different scenarios, as opposed to just, doing the ab wheel until I have cramps everywhere and I'm hunched over for 3 days until I can do it again. Like there's been a shift in my perception of what core training is, in terms of like what entails core training and the benefit of core training, since like I don't know, when I was doing an ab wheel back in like I don't know 2001 versus now.
Yeah, I think the emphasis, it's funny, like what's better or worse. Like in some ways, I look at it this way after saying a sentence of a bunch of words and actually not saying anything. I think that core training is the first lesson you are going to learn in training, regardless of how you approach it. So your best bet is to approach it head on, because
Yeah.
you don't want to have to learn the hard way. Like I think it's the first thing. If I think of, I really like the term movement quality. And
Yeah.
if I think of the movement quality that's going to rear its head if gone unaddressed or untaught, more importantly, not unlearned, but not learned, not as someone has learned it, unlearned it, just has never really learned it to begin with, it will be the thing. And, we're uniquely situated to have a particular bias towards this, given our vocation being people whose phone rings when someone's back hurts. But our phone has rung a lot over the last 10 years. And most of the time, it's when someone is in the process of learning a lesson that should have maybe been prioritized out of the gate. Now, it's not by any stretch of the imagination the last lesson you need to learn in training, but I do think if you are going to have a long and illustrious training career, which coincides with, a long and illustrious life, you're going to need to, at a certain point, either preemptively learn how to go about core training and integrate core training and learn how the effects of using your core both under load and not in day-to-day life and lifting, because it's something that if you glass over, it will force itself through like a repressed memory as a child. Like, think of it's basically childhood trauma. It's like a couple sessions with a therapist, that shit with you and your uncle is coming out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that's going to be the first. Now, it might not be the last thing, but it's going to, your inability to control your midsection will be a bottleneck at some point in your career in a way more predictable at scale than I think any other movement quality, right? Like, some people will have, I know fucking librarians that have cysts in their wrist, inside of the extensor retinaculum, and they just structurally cannot get into a decent front rack position in their wrist. And you're like, okay, fair play. I could train 1,000 people and maybe 2 are going to struggle with the movement quality of wrist extension under load. And that's going to force us off the path of, maybe some sort of supplemental movement or an alternate way of loading. And we need to manage expectations accordingly. If I train 1,000 people, at some point, if I train all 1,000 long enough, all 1,000 are going to have to learn how to use that movement quality. So I think it is the first hurdle that people will run into with their training journey. And I think as shepherds to that journey, it's something that we should be prioritizing out of the gate. I think that begs, many more questions as to the how and the whys and the X's and the O's. But I think first and foremost, regardless of the brand of fitness you're subscribing to, the table that you're sitting at in the fitness community, I think each of them need to have their own branded version of how we address the midsection. And I will further this point just one step further. If you are part of a fitness cohort, a fitness brand, an activity that you can do forever without addressing the midsection either directly or indirectly, may I suggest finding another table. If you are not at a table that will load your body to the point where that's going to be addressed directly or indirectly, then I think you might want to reconsider the investment of your time into this brand of fitness, because if you're going to push the aerobic capacity, if you're going to push strength, if you're going to push load to a meaningful way where you're going to start to move, these markers on a blood panel, like you referred to, potentially even looking at bone density and the improvement of bone density on something like a DEXA scan or something like that, you're going to at some point put yourself in a potentially susceptible position in your midline. If you are working at an intensity, a duration, for a volume that's going to move these physiological markers, your core will be potentially compromised if not addressed. And if you're sitting at a table where your training ethos does not address that directly or indirectly, then you're probably not set to reap any of the benefits of resistance training.
Pilates needs to die.
Wow, we went for Pilates first. I was thinking Tai Chi, but
Tai Chi. Oh man, I've seen a big uptick in the amount of people that do Pilates on a regular basis. And Pilates is the new what yoga used to be. Like, yoga used to be, I need to work on my flexibility and core strength, so I'm going to do yoga. And it's like, all right, maybe if you've never done anything, that's a good entry point. And it's a very low stimulus thing, so there's going to be a very low ceiling for progression. But Pilates is even lower. Like, unless you have an ongoing serious back injury, Pilates is not going to do it for you. You're literally laying down on a bed that's on a bunch of pulleys and thinking that you're doing anything to benefit yourself.
So I'm gonna, dude, I don't know, man. I don't know what type of Pilates studios you've been walking by in the Bay Area, but I think
the ones with the sex cage.
Is it bad? Oh, they got that too?
Like Doc J.
I need you to call your dad after this. Like like that's a repressed memory that's coming up. Like speaking of repressed memories, we gotta page in. It's gonna turn into a radio show after a while. I don't know if that's the first. I think there is a way because I'm thinking of my boy Sean. And
Who's
Sean, fuck, I'm trying to pull up his handle. He's a pre-script coach. What country are you at, Sean? He's somewhere in Southeast Asia. I fucking was just talking to him the other day.
Okay.
And he does Pilates and he does it in a way where you're like, okay, I get it. Pilates has a really low. No, you're out. You're out Sean. The game. Yeah, Sean, I'm out here. I'm out here fighting for you, dog.
Yeah, Sean, get a barbell, homie.
I think here's one that I think is potentially we could both agree, and not that it's impossible, but a lot of times when people elect for it, it ends up being net problematic. And there's obviously going to be context where this is the case. But meet me at aqua aerobics. Meet me at aqua fitness. Yeah. Can we meet there and chill?
I have one client who does aquatic aerobics. This client, I believe he was shot in the face in the Vietnam War. That would put him at Vietnam.
Sorry, no, my facial expression was about the shot in the face, not the war.
Oh yeah, I'm trying to get the timeline right here. I don't want to get that wrong, but yes, shot in the face. So he doesn't have a nose. He's in his 70s now. So if that puts it at Vietnam War, then that's what it was. But he was absolutely shot in the face. That's the thing that's not up for debate. How long ago it was, that's the thing that I'm not sure on.
Mid 70s was Vietnam War.
Okay, so that would kind of check out. So he entered a study at the VA it was trying to draw a correlation between cognitive capacity and water exercise. So he did this water aerobics course. Now keep in mind, he's in his 70s and he's been shot in the face. That's someone that I think is included well into that study. Right? That's someone that like, okay, let's see the correlation here. And keep in mind, this is cognitive capacity. This is not core strength. This isn't longevity. It's nothing along those lines. It's cognitive capacity. So if you're in that population and that's what you're after, I think aquatic exercise, very appropriate. Very appropriate. Maybe even people with like severe spinal issues where weight bearing is a real problem for you. Yeah. I say that works out. If you're not that, I don't see the benefit whatsoever.
So I'll paint some context over here for those who really get a lot of direct spinal loading in, like, let's go with our pros, right? I don't mind in the early off season for a guy who's fucking 280 or 290 linebacker. If I need to get some sort of stimulus or conditioning and we're dealing with a knee or an ankle, sure. But what he has is direct and indirect core loading for fucking 20 weeks of the regular season into the playoffs, right? So again, painting context, but this is like, because the problem becomes like, let's think about our parents, right? We're looking mid to late 60s, early 70s, varying degrees of fitness across the board. If I were to put my mom in the pool, let's say, and have her train, better than no training? Sure. Yeah. Something that I want her doing in 2 years? No. Something I want her to help scale up to dealing with the forces of gravity? Yes. Right. So I think it's all about placing this on the spectrum of how one tolerates gravity. And I think what that might do is it might put you in a position where you actually become less tolerant. If that's the only exertion is in a position where gravity isn't, really doing what it's doing to you every other moment of the day.
Yeah. And I think you nailed it. That's the benefit of being in the water. It's load management. It's a manipulation of the way that your body's interacting with the gravitational forces that we're under 24/7 when we're not in the water. So that's a regression on land exercise, right? That's a regression. I need to figure out what the fuck Pilates is, but I'm pretty sure that Pilates like is on the same level because I think you're just laying down on this bed, like pulling handles and shit the whole time.
But there's other exercises where you're doing like pikes and shit. I've seen some. I bet you they could. Yeah, like I'm not defending it. I just think
Okay.
there are like, okay, I'm gonna shut up.
So I'll do some research on what Pilates is. I'll tell you what it isn't. It's not what you want to be
Okay,
doing if you want to get strong. That's what
fair,
it isn't.
fair, fair, fair play. Yeah, yeah.
But either way, either of those is a load management tool because we're not directly opposing the force of gravity with our body, and we're not necessarily using our core to create stability in a way that allows us to express force at our extremities against gravity. So that's what it's not. The way I'm picturing it, like I think it's called a reformer, like doing shit like that. Okay. And I'm sure there are ways where you can use it to be more advantageous and piking. Yes, very difficult in terms of core musculature, but I think I think you said it perfectly. Is that this is a load management tool, and this is something like the water is something we're going to use when we need to decrease the way that the forces that gravity is acting upon our spine, our axial skeleton, and hence our core musculature. Now, there is a very real ceiling to progression with that. Even if it is piking on a Pilates reformers, yes, that's difficult, but what's the option over time? Instead of doing 30 seconds of piking, you do 60, you do 90, you do 34 minutes of piking. And once you get to that point, it's you've reached the upper end of how you can progress that, right? It's time and volume, yes, but there's going to be such a diminishing return once you get to that point that you've established a baseline of capacity to move, whether that's strength, whether that's endurance, that is no longer being challenged with that modality. So eventually there needs to be something that's going to allow you to interact with a greater proportion of gravity, and whether that is just being on dry land or whether that is getting off the Pilates reformer and putting a kettlebell in your hand or a dumbbell in your hand or a bar on your back. There's every single one of these tools is going to have a ceiling for progress, and that's kind of more so the statement or the idea that I was trying to refute, is that it's just because you do Pilates, it's not good for your core, right? It can be a vehicle to get you from point A to point B, but understanding that once you get to point B, there's no more room for progression on that. Just like the aquatic exercise, like yes, maybe there will be cardiovascular or cognitive benefits to doing something like that on a regular basis, but for you to continue to improve your fitness level, you're going to have a greater stimulus at some point. And the stimulus in which you can elicit to the core musculature, there's going to be a relatively low ceiling to those vehicles of exercise that maybe it takes you to a point where you'll be symptom free with whatever you're dealing with. Maybe you can function relatively well day to day, but training should eventually get to a point where it's going to be more difficult than the tasks that you're going to have to do on a day-to-day basis, whether that's life or whether that's catch a football 30 yards downfield.
Pilates is good for your core in the same way 6 cheeseburgers is good for the diet of someone who usually eats 7.
Right. Yes.
Right? It's like, that's kind of like 6 cheeseburgers is bad for everyone unless your normal diet is 7 cheeseburgers. Then 6 cheeseburgers is good. Like, you know what I mean? It's
Right.
it's
Yeah.
it's unfortunately, I think where we're at, if you're to look at the cross section of tables inside this, this metaphorical high school cafeteria, and start to see just the number of training camps that have evolved, right? Like, and you could go across brands between, Barry's boot camp to Orange Theory to F45 to, kettlebell specific work to, you name it, powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, into followers on Instagram of particular training apps or whatever. Like, there's literally an infinite number of these things. When you're looking at how many of those tables have a training style that's intense enough for that, our early conversation of like, hey, look, if you're not going to run into core issues, you're not going to run into training results, right? Like, that's kind of what I maintain. It's like, if you are not, and this is true at every level, at a
Yes.
certain point in my powerlifting career, what was the weak link was the midsection. It's really more of a physical problem of leverages and how we apply force through the arms and the legs and the axial skeleton. It's like, inevitably, this will always be the lever that's furthest away from the point that the force is applied, right? Like, it's just the way, again, unless the only time I can't think of a time where it would be unless I'm attaching weight onto my ribs or attaching weight onto my pelvis, which, I wouldn't recommend, it's always going to have this longest lever where the force is going to magnify and accumulate in everything we do. So it's an odd proxy of effectiveness of an exercise program, but I think a proxy of effectiveness nonetheless is if you are looking at long-term programming of a particular brand of fitness and you don't foresee where the midsection might get compromised or where there is direct training to offset a compromise of the midsection, you're probably looking at something that's not going to be intense enough to really move some of these meaningful markers that you might be chasing of bone density, cholesterol, VO2 max, these things that are tied into longevity. So, midline training is, I think, by that definition, a good proxy of efficacy. Is there going to be long-term potential for this type of training to wreak havoc at the lumbar spine, pelvis complex region? If yes, great. Great. We're dealing with something that's loadable, that has scalability and volume and intensity and endurance. That's good. That's good. That's good. Let's not avoid it because it has this inevitability. Let's talk about core training and how we can offset this so we can reap not only the benefit of this intense style training that's going to move the needle, but we can also preemptively lay down some foundation through the midsection so we can continue to do this intense enough activity for prolonged periods of time.
Yeah, absolutely. The way I look at core training, and I can only think of a few scenarios where it's not going to matter. And that's going to be isolated, like knee down, lower leg training, isolated elbow down, forearm training. And the reason that I say that is because no matter what you're doing in terms of an athletic sense, even if it's picking up a bag of groceries, typically what you're going to be doing is a closed chain exercise where the load is probably going to be on your shoulders or in your hand, or maybe you're stabilized, like even a quad extension or hamstring curl, like you're sitting down, but your pelvis is going to be a leverage point for force production. And the way that I look at this is that for us to create movement, there's going to be force created and there's going to be return force. And if we could properly manage both of those, then that return force will go into the intended implement, right? So I think like an RDL is an easy example. I have dumbbells in my hand, my feet are on the ground, and what I'm doing is I'm creating force through my lower body musculature, through glutes, hamstrings, that I'm going to now push my feet into the ground. And if there's no lapse in stability, I'm going to get that return force all the way back through. And the way I look at it is joints. Every joint in my body, through my ankles, my knees, my pelvis, every joint in my spine, my shoulder, elbow, wrist, into that implement. And if there's enough force transfer in the system, enough force being produced and transferred, then I will create movement. But every single joint is an opportunity to either transfer force completely or lose force, or there be a lapse in force transferred in that area, right? And a lapse of force transferred in an area that's going to manifest as movement. And that force doesn't just go away. It gets absorbed into the structure of that area, right? So if I'm doing an RDL and I have perfect stability from my ankles all the way up to my hands holding onto that dumbbell, it's going to be a 1-to-1 force transfer. I'm transferring every bit of force into the ground, getting it back through my entire body, my entire spine, into those dumbbells. Perfect. That's best case scenario. It's never going to be best case scenario. Even in the most technically proficient lifter, there's always going to be some lapse in stability along the way. But the less lapse in stability that there is, the more complete the force transfer is, and the safer the movement is, because we're loading the functional tissue, we're loading the muscles, and we're loading them to the majority, or to the extent that's going to create change in the musculature. It's going to create movement, and it's being expressed as movement in the dumbbells and not necessarily movement in, say, my spine. We have, I don't know, what, 12, 5, 17, what do we have, 7 cervicals, so it's 24 vertebra. Each of those, there's the joint with the IVD on the bottom, there's 2 facet joints, and the joint with the IVD on top. So that's like each vertebra technically has 4 joints. So 4 times 24, we're at what, 96 joints in the spine. Okay. That's 96 opportunities for force to leak somewhere. And if there's any leak along the way, that okay, if I leak at L5, then I'm moving to L4 with a less complete force transfer. And now I have an opportunity every vertebra up the chain to now lose force transfer, to transfer a lower proportion of force. So the spine is going to be your greatest opportunity to reduce that loss in force transfer. And not to mention that if we're losing that force transfer, where's it going? It's going into lumbar discs. It's going into facet joints. It's going into spinal ligaments. So it's going into structures that aren't the difference between those structural components of a joint and we'll say the functional components, the muscles, is that load into muscle creates adaptation. Load into structure also creates adaptation. But load into muscle is going to be a more favorable adaptation, right? We're better equipped to lay down more muscle and to create adaptation that's going to allow us to create more force over time. Versus the adaptation into more inert structures like ligaments and discs, it's typically going to cause inflammation. It could cause breakdown, and it's going to ultimately weaken those structures. As opposed to joints, it will cause adaptation in terms of calcium deposit, and that's what we call degenerative arthritis. So as we put force into more structural components, we're actually weakening the system. We're decreasing our capacity. Versus if we keep that force in the muscular components, then we're creating favorable adaptations. So we really only have those options when we're talking about how we're loading and how we're producing and transferring force. So that's how I look at core stability. Is like core stability. That's going to transfer in every single movement that involves the spine or things that indirectly attach to the spine, directly, indirectly, like the pelvis, the scapula, the rib cage. Like anything that you're loading musculature that attaches to those things, it's your ability to stabilize your core is going to have an impact on that movement.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting topic about force transfer, which I think if there is an intersection in the body that is most useful to have this conversation, the great mathematics, by the way, the on the fly calculus is really that you lost me there. I was just going to make up a number.
Brought to you by Zinn.
Zinn, yes, Zinn does math for you. Okay, so force transfer. Look, and I'm almost remiss to bring this up as a topic on the podcast because of shiny red ball syndrome. And I've actually seen this field of study itself suffer from shiny red ball syndrome from people who are very, very smart. And so we're going to talk a little bit about fascia. Not a lot. I think it's worthy of an extremely long conversation to properly put it into context. It's something we talk about in L1 and L2, something you see in real life in L3. And I'll write something eventually on the topic of fascia. So I want you to, as you're listening to this, I want you to not turn off the podcast and then start espousing that fascia is the answer to every problem. It's a part of a system that goes overlooked that isn't, it's obviously integral, and it's like this is what I love about the human body. Whether or not you're focusing on training a particular system or you're even aware that these systems are at play, you oftentimes can't parse out and avoid training these systems. As you start to look at the body and try to solve more complex problems, understanding how subtle shifts towards these systems, while never excluding one from the sum of its parts, you'll start to understand the tensegrity. So tensegrity, I think, is a word that's worth defining, especially as we talk about force transfer, as we talk about fascia. Tensegrity is the amalgamation of the words tension and integrity. That's what tensegrity is, right? So tensegrity is, simply put, when something moves over here, something else has a counter force or movement somewhere else, right? So this tensegrity system, or this tensegrity model, is tension and integrity. How do we vary tension but also maintain integrity? When we talk about core training, because let's dive into some more prescriptive stuff, because I think it's a really good way it's a really good place for us to use the definition of a muscle's function and a muscle's action, right? Because there are two camps in core training. And I think one actually is, so there's like the bodybuilding style hypertrophy core training, which has been is so pushed down and repressed from our six-pack shortcuts origins. We have forgotten our history, friends. Mike Chang is rolling around in he's not actually dead. He's tying his ponytail very aggressively, that we have forgot the teachings of Mike Chang, the six-pack guru. And I think we do that to our peril. So what I mean by that is, sit-ups, rope crunches, ab machines, things that are oftentimes looked at as not functional. And then all of a sudden we get farmers carries, Palloff presses. Guys, girls, ladies and gentlemen, where am I? Camera one. Okay, please stop with the farmers carries in the core. Like, stop. I'm not buying it, so you should stop selling it. Like, is that really? No, it's not. It's not a good core exercise. It's compared to what is possible in moving and challenging the core from like the obliques from insertion to origin. And here's where fascia ties the room together. And this is where people have this blind elephant phenomenon of their knowledge. Is they someone is sitting at the tail of an elephant with fucking no sight, and they're just feeling around going, well, this is some sort of rope. It's like, no, it's not. When you take a step back and you look at all the five blind men, you realize you're like, no, you're all fucking standing in front of an elephant. When we don't understand, if we don't understand the idea of integrated systems, we can't understand the body. And two, a lot of times when you're starting to see phenomenon that acts abnormal to what your model predicts, what you are likely missing is a system. And I think what a lot of people miss when it comes to the core and the idea of like, what is functional training of the core? How do we fight off these energy leaks from muscle into more inert passive structures, as you highlighted? And this is where fascia comes in. So when you look at resistance training exercises that may be more attuned to the hypertrophy principles that we would train our bicep and our tricep and our quads and our hamstrings, and we apply those to the core, which so often we don't. So often we just go like big three, resisting force, bird dog, curl up, side plank, progression, Palloff press, farmers carries, all of this isometric stuff. It's like, where's the stretch? Where's the shortening? Where's the contraction? Where's the hypertrophy? And the hypertrophy is actually the fucking answer. That's the answer when we understand how the system of fascia integrates through our midsection to help transfer force. So let's go high level with this. Fascia, what is it? It's fucking sausage casing. It's not. It's way more than that. It's really complicated. It's rich and dense in proprioceptors. Has a ton of mechanoreceptors. It's a big part of our system. It's tricky to research because the second someone dies, it's basically all aqueous, and we cut them open, and where did it go? Where did all the fascia go? Sausage casing. Stick with me. If I'm making sausages, as someone who's never made sausages before, I think about the casing, and you think about what you're putting in the sausage, and then you think about twisting the links. Muscle mass is the stuff that you put in the sausage casing. It's your ground beef. It's your fucking squirrel. It's whatever the fuck is in a ballpark, Frank, right? It's your goddamn raccoons. In order for me to create more tension and a more seamless transfer through this casing, it behooves me to fill the casing up with more raccoon and squirrel. It behooves me to have more muscle, right? So this is where, it's one thing to look at core training. And I think this is where we talk, going back to our original kind of opening conversation of like, what have we potentially lost in core training that we never knew we had from Mike Chang early days, is like a lot of the principles of six-pack shortcuts, P90X ab workouts, 300 workout from the magazine when the movie came out. You're laughing because you did it and I
Oh,
did it in a
dude,
pair.
hell
I
yeah.
think of a world so often where you and I were doing the exact same dumb shit at the exact same time. Like, I just think that I just have this fucking twin that was in Pennsylvania doing fucking windshield wipers with
Oh,
135 and all,
yeah.
right? You know exactly
Yeah.
what I'm
Oh,
talking
fuck yeah,
about.
dude.
And it's just like, but to me, it's like, okay, we move towards this health, holistic function, animal flow, kumbaya bullshit, and it's not bullshit. It's just you're trading off. You're focusing on the casing without focusing on the filling. It's like you got to have both, and it's when you don't understand. Like someone's like, "Oh, like why are you doing rope crunches? Why am I doing things that are more attuned with like hypertrophy principles of the rest of our skeletal muscles that we train?" It's like I'm doing it for the same reason you're doing some wood chopper or you're doing some med ball throw, because you're focusing on the casing, I'm focusing on the filling, but both of these are needed for adequate and efficient force transfer. And people, like, again, fascia, and I don't want people to leave here going like fascia, 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 making fucking posts on fascia. It's complicated. So approach this horizon in your understanding of fitness with a little bit of wisdom as you've approached other things, got excited about them, realize that the results on the other side are not this fucking, epiphany moment, and that it actually just falls in this whole system. Because again, you can't avoid training fascia, right? And the
Yeah.
load that you use, the magnitude of the load, the speed of the load, the direction of the load, the type of load, the type of concentric, eccentric phase, all of that affects fascia. So it's like, so when people are like, I do neuromuscular training, it's like, yeah, so does everyone else, you fucking idiot. Like, it's, you do training, and fascia
Right.
is a part of that. It's just I do a lot of direct core work now, and I do a lot of side bending, oblique work. I do a lot of rotational oblique stuff, TVA stuff, a lot of direct rectus abdominis work. Why? Because if I have bigger fucking abs, I have more sausage in the casing, and then my force transfer as a byproduct of that fascial link. And where do fascial links most commonly break down? Through the midsection, where we're reliant on this fascial system to really prop up. I've used this analogy before. I'll use it again. I'll make a YouTube video about it. Like, the pelvis is kind of like a suspension bridge. The ribs, the sternum, and the spine, if we were to take a suspension bridge and turn it into a roundabout. So you have this giant circle of a road that's suspended by two pillars on underneath, which would be your legs, and then two spires up on either side with wires going all the way around. Those two spires, the top of these pillars, are going to be your xiphoid process and your lumbar spine. And then as we tie these suspension wires up and around, what you're actually using is, sure, we can look at the obliques, we can look at the erectus, but what you're actually seeing, it's the sausage casing. It's the sausage casing that creates that tension that allows you to transfer force effectively across that sort of hemi bridge of this suspension pelvis ribcage model. And so don't look down on me and people who look at me like, well, why do, like, the functional bros that look at me doing direct core work. It's like, you want to try it? Like, you wish a motherfucker would. Like, I'm doing what you think you're doing, but just for real. Right?
Yeah.
I can integrate that stuff after, but if I don't have if there's not meat in the casing, you're just coming in fucking wielding a bunch of flaccid sausage skin at me. And it's like, okay, like, you need some substance in there. And I think that's where a lot of people miss the boat, is they miss the boat on a core hypertrophy. And they look at this like some sort of mystical part of the body that responds different. It's like, no, it's a little bit like more difficult to load because it's more midline and the references are a little bit trickier. But lengthening, hypertrophy, direct tension, constant tension, progressive overload, and the big kick in the fucking head is that people don't realize that this is the thing that's going to allow them to move more fluidly through these positions. It's going to allow them to have that function that they need. Everyone focuses on the sausage casing. You got to fill that fucking shit up, son. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I love it. And the point that I want to make, kind of off the backs of that, is that I think core training was perceived early on to be like hypertrophy training for the core, right? Which is not wrong, but I think there's different benefits to the way that you go about core training, right? I think probably in the last 10 years or so, there's more of that functional crowd that thinks like more resisting movement through the core is functional core training. But the way I think of it is like, what's the adaptation that you're going to elicit with either of these things, right? Is it hypertrophy? And in terms of like isometrics for the core, like carries or like plank type stuff, or how we'll talk about like an RDL is another good example in resisting movement through the sagittal plane through the core. Like, yeah, there is a ton of benefit to these things, but if I'm trying to get stronger quads, I'm probably not just going to do isometric training, right? But isometric training does have a place in doing that, because isometric training is really good in terms of building proprioception, building awareness at specific joint angles, and kind of capping out the capacity at which you already have created. It's not necessarily going to be the most efficient or effective way to increase capacity through an area. That's going to have to be something more dynamic, something where you're moving through an eccentric and a concentric phase. So the way I look at it is that yes, you should be doing direct core work, core hypertrophy work, and more dynamic things for the core. And that's going to be the way to increase your capacity in those muscle groups. And then the way to coordinate that and create stability is going to be the more isometric things, like the unilateral carries, unilateral loads, and your hinging and your split squats and barbell movements. Those are going to be the things that allow you to coordinate that capacity. So I think both should coexist, or at least exist as tools of load management, because more dynamic training through the core is going to be more fatiguing, and there's going to be a greater recovery cost to training that way. So that could be something that you use in phases where you have a lower recovery cost to other areas. So maybe like for a strength athlete in a period where you're working on technique, load on your main lifts is a little bit lighter, that might be a really good time to focus on core hypertrophy, versus where you're making the switch and you're eliciting more stress or more stimulus through your main lifts. Then it might be a time to maintain and focus on coordination through more isometric type core exercises. So I think that's the way that my thinking on this has evolved, is like, what's the stimulus here? What's the recovery cost associated with it? And what's the overall benefit to the task that we need to accomplish? And being able to overlay those three things to make the appropriate choice for that specific time, for that specific person, on how they should be training their core.
Love it. Yeah. I think it's something where it not only does it highlight a lot of the missteps, I think, in fitness and misconceptions,
Right.
it also highlights a lot of the inevitabilities of fitness, like the fact that it's complex, but it's not necessarily complicated.
Right.
And I think the core is definitely that. And what makes it that is what we talked about, is this will be, unless taken a fairly sophisticated approach or thought out approach, this is going to be a bottleneck at every level, or for everyone at any level in any fitness pursuit worth pursuing. So if you're a fitness professional, get your sound bite right. Get your ducks in order around how you program for this, for different skill levels, for different activities, for different body compositions. Understand the recovery debt of the different ways of implementing types of training. Understand where the core plays a role in spinal bracing under heavy loads, right? Like I see it so backwards all the time.
Yeah.
Early client comes in overweight. Okay, what do we do? It's the same thing with like shoulder stuff. I see people trying to like throw kettlebells over someone's. It's like, well, why? They don't have a muscle is a sensory organ, and so far as that muscle is an output organ. You know what's going to really help stabilize someone's shoulder who's never lifted their fucking arm over their head? A straight bar tricep press down with a cable. Because they don't, everyone's like, oh, like it's these fucking kids at the gym. I strained my lat. Like, you don't have a lat. What do you strained your lat, you fuck? You're 130 pounds. Get out of here. You need that. So it's about understanding contextually, like, hey, rather than teaching this fucking lady how to squat who's about to fall on her face, put her on a leg press, and instead of fucking priming her with this cat cow into bird dog bullshit, why don't you have her do fucking resisted sit-ups or rope crunches something that's actually going to build some level of tone in that muscle, force it to drive output in a stable position. And then as you titrate up to, hey, we can move to a goblet squat now. Cool. If we're going to need her core, let's not run the fatigue debt, but she's probably, because of the fatigue debt we've ran with doing this isolated flexion, extension, lateral flexion under load, we can now actually push this brace further than we otherwise would have. So it's like, it's just hilarious to watch people get, and again, wrong. And this is the great thing about the human body and the frustrating thing about teaching it. It's like, because we don't have a chance to A/B test, it takes experience to understand how much further you can get quicker with a well-principled approach to training, right? So it's because I've taken clients and tried to squat them for 6 to 8 weeks and then done the bird dog curl up side plank. And then I switched my paradigm with someone and did fucking rope crunches with them for 6 weeks, did leg press with them for 6 weeks, and then could put them in a squat pattern, progress their squat pattern, and have way more weight on the person's bar 12 weeks down the road because I altered my paradigm. And that's where like the experience factor comes in and your ability to control variables and test and retest. But like the principles are sound. And what really helps you tie this together is like, hey, there's more at play here than just, muscle action versus muscle function. Oh, that's bodybuilder shit. That's this. It's like, understand the role of integrated systems, right? Understand. And tensegrity is a really great physical representation of the biomechanical model, because it helps explain the how the hypertrophy and the muscle action and the insertion from origin actually helps the muscle function, static resisting stability force, and how that then loops back into making that better, stronger, bigger, more transferable. So it's just like, again, it's complex. It's not complicated. It just takes a bit of thought. But if you're going to pay attention to anything and you're going to put thought into anything as a coach, as a trainer, this will be a hurdle in your client's development if you have a programming strategy, style, ethos around training that actually develops people's physicality. So get this part right. So when you hit this roadblock, you know how to program around it. Nailed it. I like that, man. I like that we come back to different topics and we have completely different, not different takes, but there's so many different ways to look at this. And I think that was a pretty unique one. We might see this one again shortly. But yeah, change of the podcast coming from a formatting perspective. We've mentioned this in the last couple of shows. Our boy Jorge De Hoyos, aka
El Trace,
Big Poppy himself, with B Schultz on the ones and twos. Brandon Schultz, Strength in Context podcast coming at you live. So do keep an eye out for that. Follow the boys on IG. Mac and Thayer, the Sunday show, as you know it here on RX Radio, is moving to their own channel. Really excited for that. Paint the Edges with James McIntosh and James Thayer coming to you this October. And of course, Jordan Jiunta and Jordan Shallow, aka Red, White, and Jordan at the _muscle_doc. Still going to hold it down on Wednesdays for you. Again, October is the switch is going to happen. We'll put all the links up in coming weeks' episodes, guys. Appreciate you hanging out, and we'll see you guys next week.